Hi everyone, welcome to our lecture on the nervous system. The nervous system is the last organ system that we're going to be covering this semester, and it's one that we're going to be spending several weeks on. Over the course of the next several weeks, we'll be getting an introduction to the nervous system. We'll be talking about the cells of the nervous system, including the anatomy, physiology, various classifications, basic physiological processes and properties, as well as diseases that affect the cells of the nervous system. We'll then begin a discussion of the divisions of the nervous system, including the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. A good place to start our discussion is with an understanding of what the nervous system does. And fundamentally, a function of the nervous system is communication. Communication is the main function of the nervous system, but as we all know, communication can be a complicated process. It'll involve listening to information, processing that information that it heard, and then acting appropriately in regards to the information that it acquired. So communication is a process that happens in three basic steps, and that is with a listening phase. So for the nervous system, that would include listening to any changes that are occurring inside the body or outside the body, evaluating that information, so that would be the next step. Okay, so evaluation of the information that we heard. And then the last step in nervous system function is initiating an appropriate response. So after you process the information, the nervous system is going to be involved in carrying out the response based on the information that we received. So fundamentally, the nervous system is involved in communication, and we're going to spend a lot of time over the next few weeks talking about how the nervous system is able to accomplish these various functions. We'll also talk about the anatomical structures within the nervous system, such as the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. And what we'll do over the course of these lectures is talk in more detail about the structure of the brain, the structure of the spinal cord, and the structure of nerves. This is a very basic overview of the anatomy of the nervous system, showing us a couple of things. That would be the three main structures that we were talking about on the last slide, including the brain, the spinal cord, as well as these yellow structures that are called nerves. And these anatomical structures are actually put into different divisions of the nervous system. So all these structures that exist within the nervous system can be subdivided into one of our two divisions of the nervous system. And those two divisions of the nervous system are called the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Anatomically, the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system is composed of these structures, which are called nerves. The central and the peripheral nervous systems are very interesting in that they are anatomically continuous, and they're also functionally continuous as well. So kind of how it works, the nerves of the body, which are part of the peripheral nervous system, they're typically involved in sensing things, or they're involved in doing things. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But what they can do is they can sense information wherever they exist, and then they can potentially carry out an action in that location. And nerves can be really different in terms of whether they do both of these. So some nerves are involved in doing both a sensing and a doing process, and some are just specialized to do one or the other of those functions. But what nerves do, they can sense information and they will send it to the central nervous system. And the central nervous system would be involved in processing and interpreting that information received by the nerves of the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system's the decision maker. It's made up of the brain and spinal cord. So what it'll do is it'll make a decision based on that information received by those nerves, and it can initiate a response, an appropriate response to that information, which is also going to be carried out by the nerves. And those nerves would be the ones that are involved in doing things and carrying out different actions. So you can't really separate out the central nervous system and peripheral nervous systems well, because they absolutely work together to accomplish that communication function. It's just that the peripheral nervous system is more involved in relaying information to or from the central nervous system, and the central nervous system is really, really big into processing that information and making a decision about what to do with that information. So think about the central and the peripheral nervous systems working together to accomplish that broader communication function. So the central nervous system, like we said, is one of our subdivisions of the nervous system, and it is the structural and functional center of the entire nervous system. It's comprised of the brain and spinal cord, and these are the functions that it carries out. It's going to be able to receive information from the peripheral nervous system. That information that it receives is called sensory information. The central nervous system would then take that sensory information and evaluate it. And if need be, we can, using the central nervous system, initiate an appropriate response. And I'll give you a good example here in a second. The peripheral nervous system is the one that lies outside of the brain and spinal cord, and it's comprised of structures called nerves. So nerves are the main structures found within the peripheral nervous system. And nerves are involved in information relay. So they can send information to the central nervous system, or they can carry information away from the central nervous system. So we'll talk in a little bit here about neurons and nerves. We'll eventually get to nerves. But what you should know for now about these peripheral nervous system structures, we can send information to the central nervous system, and those pathways to the CNS are called sensory pathways. And the pathways of the peripheral nervous system that would start in the central nervous system and extend outward to different body structures, those would be called motor, because the information is going out of the central nervous system via the peripheral nervous system, who will be able to carry out an action. And that action is actually considered a motor function, because you're moving something, you're doing something using these motor pathways. So we'll talk more about this relay of information from the peripheral nervous system to the brain and spinal cord of the central nervous system, as well as how the peripheral nervous system is able to carry information from the central nervous system out to different body structures. So there are a lot of different ways to classify the nerves that carry that information within the peripheral nervous system. Nerves can be classified as sensory, motor, or something called mixed nerves. The sensory nerves are the ones that carry information to the CNS. Motor nerves are ones that carry information from the CNS to different body structures. Mixed nerves are nerves that can carry information both directions. So mixed nerves would be able to carry information into the CNS as well as outside of the CNS. And we'll talk more about that, but those are kind of your functional classifications. Okay. We also have structural classifications. For nerves. And they have to do more with the structures that they're originating from. And for example, we have nerves that come off of the brain called cranial nerves. And we also have some nerves that come off the spinal cord. Those are called spinal nerves. So these are structural or anatomical classifications for nerves. And we're going to talk about these classifications certainly a lot more as we move through the nervous system lectures. But these are your two subdivisions of the nervous system, the central and the peripheral nervous systems. As we were just discussing, there are two main subdivisions to the nervous system, the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. And if you recall, the central nervous system is involved in receiving sensory information, processing that information, or just simply making a decision about that information, and carrying out a response based on the decision made by structures such as the brain and spinal cord. So the brain and spinal cord are involved in receiving sensory information, processing that information, and carrying out an appropriate response. Now, the peripheral nervous system is the subdivision of the nervous system that will relay the information into the brain or spinal cord and also carry out the determined response. So the peripheral nervous system is anatomically and functionally a little bit more complicated than the central nervous system for us, because you can separate the two different functions of the peripheral nervous system into two subdivisions of subdivisions of a subdivision. The peripheral nervous system has what is called a sensory division, and the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system is involved in sending information from the periphery. So pretty much anywhere outside of the brain or spinal cord would be considered peripheral. So the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system will send sensory information from the periphery to the central nervous system, while the motor division of the peripheral nervous system would be carrying information out of the central nervous system to different body structures. Maybe that body structure is skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle or some gland of the body. But the motor division will be carrying information out of the CNS to various body structures. Those two subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system do have different names, and they are afferent, which is the same as saying the sensory division. And afferent, I like to remember, is got an A, so you are adding info to CNS. So that's kind of how I remember my afferent. Afferent just means you're adding information to the CNS, so the information is going into the brain or spinal cord, while our motor division is called efferent. And if you remember, the motor division actually carries information out of the CNS, so that information is said to be exiting the CNS. So E and E. So efferent is the division of the peripheral nervous system that allows information to exit the CNS. So that's sort of our two big subdivisions of the peripheral nervous system. However, you can break those sensory and motor divisions down further, okay? So I'm going to make some notations on here just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I'm going to erase this, okay? Okay. So getting my pen back here. All right. Okay. So this first classification for peripheral nervous system really is referring to direction of information flow. Are we going into the central nervous system or out? In sensory, we're going in, and in motor, we're going out of the central nervous system. You'll probably notice that the sensory and the motor subdivisions have their own divisions as well. And so you're going to see things like visceral and somatic here. And what this next level of classification refers to are the structures involved. So that just means what structures are we carrying information from to the central nervous system? And what structures are we carrying information to via the motor divisions? And so the term visceral refers to organs, and in just kind of a more um, specific sense here, what we're really referring to with organs are going to be things like intestines, stomach, various respiratory, urinary, or reproductive structures, and more specifically than that, things like smooth muscle, okay, and glands of the body. So visceral is referring to organs, smooth muscle, glands, etc., whereas somatic is referring to skeletal muscle, as well as the skin, okay? So your next level of classification for the subdivisions of the nervous system refers to the structures that are involved in the information flow. So the visceral sensory division, for instance, is of course the subdivision of the peripheral nervous system involved in sending information from your organs to the central nervous system. The somatic sensory division is the subdivision of the peripheral nervous system involved in sending sensory information from the skeletal muscles of the body to the central nervous system. Going over here to the motor divisions carry information out of the CNS. And we have already discussed this first one, the somatic motor division. This is the subdivision of the peripheral nervous system that carries information out of the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles of the body. And so you probably remember this from our discussion of somatic motor neurons and the neuromuscular junction. Yes, that is absolutely the subdivision of the nervous system that innervates your skeletal muscles and allows for voluntary muscle movements. The visceral motor division is a really, really, really important one. It is the subdivision of the peripheral nervous system, also known as the autonomic nervous system, and it is involved in involuntary automatic regulation of your body's organs. It is by far the most commonly talked about subdivision of the nervous system if you have to take A&P2, because it is the system, the division of the nervous system that is very, very involved in organ regulation. So it's really important for regulating the organs of the body. And it in itself does have two subdivisions. They are the sympathetic division as well as the parasympathetic division. So those are your two subdivisions of the visceral motor or autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic division is involved in the adrenaline rush or the fight or flight stress response, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And the parasympathetic division is involved in what is called rest and digest. So it is the division that helps you coordinate resting activities, things like digestion of foods, production of urine, and those other kind of resting body functions. So it does tend to be the case that the parasympathetic division for most of us is more active most of the time, but the sympathetic division has its role as well in our normal body functions, but it becomes very, very important during fight or flight or the adrenaline rush, which helps you deal with acute stressors, things that could pose bodily harm to you. So we'll talk more about these two subdivisions, but they are super duper important for organ regulation. So just a little bit of a recap. So maybe you didn't quite catch all of that in what I was talking about. So I have a little bit more here to share with you. Just a little bit of a recap from some of the things we've talked about so far. Remember that afferent refers to information being added to the central nervous system. So your afferent division of the peripheral nervous system refers to all the incoming sensory pathways, while the efferent division consists of all the outgoing motor pathways. So when we're talking about incoming, we mean into the CNS. And when we're talking about outgoing, we mean leaving the CNS. So that's kind of our reference point. We can also refer to our subdivisions of the nervous system according to systems or structures that are innervated. So a somatic nervous system is essentially referring to skeletal muscles or skin. And remember that for the somatic part of the peripheral nervous system, we are going to be controlling muscle contraction of skeletal muscle with our somatic motor division. And the somatic sensory division is involved in carrying information from the skeletal muscles and from the skin to integration centers in the central nervous system. So try to break these down according to the direction of information flow, incoming or outgoing, and also the system or the organs that are innervated. And remember, we might have talked a little bit about innervations in the muscular system. That just means that a particular structure has axons or a nerve supply that it is going to be contacted by. And in another, just another example here of our systems and how we can classify different divisions of the nervous system. Remember, we've got our autonomic nervous system or also visceral motor. Okay? And remember that visceral motor division is really important. It's the autonomic nervous system that controls automatic involuntary body functions. It also controls the stress response, that is the fight or flight stress response or the adrenaline rush, if that helps you remember. It is a motor division, so it will carry information to involuntary muscle types, including smooth and cardiac muscle, as well as some of these things called glands in the body. And glands are something we talk a lot about in A&P too. They produce things like hormones, important digestive enzymes, etc. So they are very, very important for normal body function. Okay. There is also a visceral sensory pathway that carries information from your organs to the central nervous system. And this is so important, guys. Even though the autonomic nervous system can trigger digestion, or it could help speed up your heart's rate or your breathing rate, we have to know what those organs are doing in the first place to know how to change them correctly and optimize them to keep you in homeostasis. So, the visceral sensory pathway is our way to know what the organs are doing. So, the visceral motor division of the nervous system can appropriately control those organs. And like I said, that visceral motor division does have a sympathetic division as well as a parasympathetic division. They do tend to be at different activity levels during different biological states. And when I say biological states, I mean a resting state and a feeding state, which would be what you have under what is called parasympathetic nervous system control, versus a fight or flight stress response biological state. And so these two divisions are active to different degrees during different biological states. The sympathetic division allows us to deal with immediate threats to our safety, to our well-being. It produces that fight or flight stress response or adrenaline rush. I'm sure we've all had one of those before. Just imagine you're trying to cross the street. The little light up guy says it's time for your turn to walk in the crosswalk, so you start walking as you're supposed to. But somebody in a car decides to run the red light and they're barreling towards you in your car. You're probably, once you see them, not going to be in a nice, calm state. You're going to go into panic mode. And that is the initiation of your fight or flight stress response. Your heart will start beating really fast. You'll start breathing really hard, really quickly, and your skeletal muscles will hopefully be contracting and moving to get you out of the path of that moving car. So this fight or flight stress response is a survival mechanism. The parasympathetic controlled body state is our rest and digest system, or breathe and feed. And this is a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system that allows us to coordinate resting and digesting activities, like digesting your food, producing urine, filtering blood to produce urine, and other activities as well. So the parasympathetic division is the one that for us, unless we are routinely stimulating that adrenaline rush, is certainly going to be the most active. And of course, one thing to note is that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions, they will have different effects on organs. So in a lot of times, the effect of the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system on an organ, they're going to be opposites. So just think about heart function, for instance. This is the heart. The sympathetic nervous system is active during stress, during fight or flight. So what you would see happening during that biological state is that your heart's going to be beating really fast. And that's to be able to pump blood, which carries oxygen and glucose to your muscles and to your brain to help you mobilize and get out of the way of danger. But if you were looking at the parasympathetic effect on the heart, the parasympathetic nervous system is kind of a resting system. And during that time, if you looked at the effect of the parasympathetic nervous system on your heart, it would have a resting effect as well. It would slow the heartbeat. And it's not just important that it slows heartbeat, it's why it slows heartbeat. During the parasympathetic body state, rest and digest, you don't need a lot of oxygen and you don't need a lot of glucose for your muscles or for your brain. So it's okay to have a slower heart rate during this time. The idea with the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions is that they will allow you to respond to changes in the environment. And when we get to autonomics, we'll talk about what happens if someone didn't have an autonomic nervous system. they would essentially be unable to maintain homeostasis or deal with any changes in the internal or external environment. So these two subdivisions are going to be a big topic of focus for us later in the semester. Okay, and remember that those two subdivisions, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions, there are going to be afferent pathways or sensory pathways that will carry that information back to integrating centers in the CNS, because we have to know what the organs are doing before we can adjust them and change their activity levels. Okay, so that's pretty much it for our introduction to the nervous system. And that's going to bring us into a discussion of the cells of the nervous system. And before we get too far into the lecture, I'll just tell you that there are two main types of cells within the nervous system. They are the neurons and the glial cells. The neurons are our communication cells. Very important. So these are the ones that communicate. Our glial cells are really support cells. So they're still both going to be really important for nervous system function, but their contributions to that are certainly going to be a little bit different. So let's start with neurons, because neurons are our communication cells. And as you know, communication is going to involve the ability to listen. And so neurons have a property called excitability. And excitability is something that will allow neurons to be listening for changes in their environment. Those changes are called stimuli, and allow them to respond to those changes. So neurons can respond to stimuli because they have the property of excitability. Neurons are also what are called conductive. So neurons are able to respond to these stimuli by producing electrical signals. If you don't remember your gradients of ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride, go back and look at those, because those are going to be really, really important for us later. Neurons can respond to stimuli by producing electrical signals that can be transmitted to other cells at distant locations. And oftentimes, the electrical signal that they transmit is the action potential. And so we will spend pretty much a whole lecture talking about action potentials as we move further into the nervous system material. A lot of neurons are able to do a process called secretion, and this is really exocytosis. We saw this process occurring in the neuromuscular junction, because remember, the neuromuscular junction does have a neuron. We've got the somatic motor neuron that is able to, after the action potential reaches the synaptic knob, trigger exocytosis of acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. And that process of releasing the neurotransmitter is secretion. It's also exocytosis. Most neurons are able to do secretion, but there are some neurons that are able to stimulate other cells in a different way. They can stimulate a cell, a neuron, another neuron, not through a chemical neurotransmitter signal, but actually an electrical signal. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move further into the nervous system material. Okay, so you probably actually know a lot of this already. The neuron is the cell of the nervous system involved in communication, and it does have three main areas. And let's point those out now and figure out what they do. So for neurons, they are going to have what are called dendrites. So these structures that I'm circling now are dendrites. They are the listening structures of the neuron. They will allow the neuron to capture neurotransmitters released from another cell, be able to respond to them. Some dendrites are sensitive to things that aren't neurotransmitters or aren't chemicals. they could respond to physical changes. So some of the neurons, their dendrites can detect physical changes. Some neurons, they can detect electrical changes. Some neurons' dendrites are able to detect changes in light levels and detect light signals. So it just varies by neuron, but the dendrites are structures that allow the neuron to receive information. We also have an important part of the neuron called the soma, and the soma is what I circled in blue there. It's also called the cell body. So the cell body of the neuron and the soma are the same thing. We would have normal organelles within the soma. So you'll have a nucleus there. So we have a nucleus within the soma, but you'll have other things too, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticuli, mitochondria, etc. So we do normal cell activities within the soma, and we also allow for the movement of any signals received in the dendrites to move. So signals received in the dendrites, they'll typically diffuse through the soma to get to this last structure of the neuron, which is called the axon. So this is the axon, and the axon is involved in a number of different processes, but it is involved in the sending of signals. It will allow for conduction of an electrical signal, and that conduction of the electrical signal would end at these structures. These are synaptic knobs. So you probably remember those from muscular. The synaptic knob is going to be our contact point between this neuron and another neuron. So they are part of the axon, but they're at the end. So this would be the site where we'd be able to release things like neurotransmitters from. Okay, so our three parts of the neuron are the dendrites that allow us to receive signals from other cells, the cell body or the soma that allows us to process those signals, well, allow the diffusion of those signals to the axon, as well as do normal cell functions, protein synthesis, DNA replication, etc. And then the axon is our last part of the neuron that allows this neuron to conduct a signal which could stimulate another neuron. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about these different parts of the neuron in relation to what they do. Just a little bit more about the anatomy before we move on too far. So again, we do have a cell body or a soma within the neuron. That's going to be where we have normal cell organelles. We can make protein molecules called neurotransmitters needed for synaptic transmission. That would involve the release of a neurotransmitter from one neuron to be captured by another neuron who could then respond to that neurotransmitter. And there are a lot of different neurotransmitters out there. We already learned about one this semester. It's called acetylcholine. But there are others, dopamine, serotonin, lysine, GABA, glutamate. You don't need to know all of these, but I would know a couple of them probably. And you probably all remember acetylcholine, so maybe just remember another one or two of these. I just wanted to rattle off some because I'm sure you've heard of some of them. Probably a lot of you've heard of serotonin and dopamine if you've taken a psychology class. But these are all different possible neurotransmitters that could be produced in the neuron, and then they would be eventually released from the neuron and could go and stimulate another neuron or another cell. Those neurotransmitters are stored into vesicles, and they are actually going to be kind of assembled in the soma, but then those vesicles with neurotransmitter will be shuttled down the axon and stored in the synaptic knob. And the process of moving those assembled vesicles from the soma to the synaptic knob is called axoplasmic transport. So you can't assemble those vesicles in the soma because that's where you're going to make those neurotransmitters and the vesicles. Put them together, and then you can send them down the axon using axoplasmic transport for storage in the synaptic knob. And we'll talk a little bit more in another lecture, in a future lecture, about what that signal for release would be. Okay. We can also do cell maintenance here in the soma. That's another important function of the soma. We have lots of mitochondria here to provide energy, ATP energy for neurons. And please note that you do actually have mitochondria down in the synaptic knob too. So they do produce ATP, which is going to be really important for neuron function. The neurons of the body actually consume about 50% of all of your ATP. That is a huge proportion of energy consumption. So we're going to talk about why that is. Like why are these cells in particular so demanding when it comes to ATP? If you recall, the dendrites are our structures of the neuron that allow us to bind to chemical signals released from other neurons, or receive electrical signals, mechanical signals, or light signals. And each neuron has at least one dendrite. Some have more. A lot of them do have multiple dendrites. The dendrites are going to have, especially if they do respond to neurotransmitters, these structures called receptors. So if you don't remember about receptors, go back and review. Those were things that we talked about in the cell unit, but receptors are membrane proteins that allow for the cell to bind to some chemical signal and respond appropriately to it. And I guess I should also specify that not all receptors bind chemicals. There are others that can bind, that can be activated or respond to stretch or light, etc. But receptors allow for a cell to receive a given signal. Some of the dendrites have what are called dendritic spines. These are protrusions on the dendrites that serve as connection points for axons of other neurons. So they are kind of more direct communication routes for reliable neural connections, ones that are used all the time. Axons are structures that allow us to conduct nerve impulses away from the cell body of the neuron. And those nerve impulses are action potentials, which we will talk more about over the course of the nervous system. Some axons are covered in a fatty layer called a myelin sheath. We'll talk about myelin a little bit today, but it is an insulating structure that increases the speed of action potential conductance. So it'll speed up the electrical signal moving down the axon. And we'll talk about why that's important and what happens if you have an axon that should be myelinated but isn't. It can cause a lot of neurological problems, but it is an important substance for many axons to ensure that the electrical signals are reaching their targets at the correct speed. So not all axons are myelinated though. Most are myelinated, but not all. Okay. You probably remember varicosities. Varicosities were structures that we talked about in terms of smooth muscle. These are swellings that can occur along an axon that allow for a synapse with other cells. So if you need to remember about the varicosities, go back and take a look at those smooth muscle, the smooth muscle section of our muscular system lecture. This is another picture of a neuron, and I'll just kind of point out some more of the structures that we were talking about. If you recall, we've got dendrites that attach to the cell body of a neuron that allow the neuron to respond to various signals. We also have a soma with normal cell organelles that's going to allow the neuron to produce proteins, make new phospholipids, package up neurotransmitters into vesicles, make ATP molecules, and just kind of in general do normal cell functions. We also have our axon here, so I'll use a different color. So we've got the axon here and the end of the axon with these synaptic knobs. This axon is actually one that is myelinated. So this axon is a myelinated one. And you can see that yellow kind of fatty insulating layer here. So that's the myelin sheath. Please note, and this is extremely important, the myelin sheath is not continuous. There are breaks in it, and those breaks are called nodes of Ranvier. We will talk a lot about these because they are extremely important for making sure that that electrical signal moves very quickly down the axon. And we'll talk about why that is, but just for now, know that the nodes of Ranvier are breaks in the myelin sheath. There's no myelin within the node of Ranvier, but they're very important for ensuring that we can pass that electrical signal down the axon very quickly. At the end of the axon, we have the synaptic knobs, so you can see those kind of here. And again, you would have vesicles filled with neurotransmitters within those synaptic knobs. You probably noticed this little offshoot here on the axon. That's something called an axon collateral. Axon collaterals would allow for a neuron to make contact with lots of different cells potentially. So this branch may extend over here, and there may be a neuron number 2 over here. So it will allow for multiple communication points between that neuron and another neuron, and maybe 100 neurons. So the axon collaterals allow for that neuron to reach more cells. Okay. So this is just a cross section of a myelinated axon, and not really a ton to point out here, except that the axon itself is not hollow, okay? So it's not a big hollow space. There are some proteins in there that'll allow us to conduct the electrical signal, and then we've got a plasma membrane that covers up the whole axon. Outside of that plasma membrane would be the myelin sheath, and hopefully what you can see is that it's arranged into layers. So those areas of myelin are actually deposited in layers, and there are a couple of different cells that do myelination in the nervous system, and they do have slightly different ways of depositing the myelin. So we'll talk about those as we move into our discussion of the glial cells of the body. But the myelin is going to be important for us. It's going to ensure that our electrical signals are reaching the end of the axon in a very quick manner. Okay, so those are kind of our anatomical regions of the neuron, but those same anatomical regions can be subdivided or kind of reclassified, I guess would be a better way to say it, into different functional zones. And the functional zones of a neuron tell us what the neuron is doing in that particular area. And so this area of the neuron, which would include the dendrites and most of the soma, is called the input zone because you're putting in a signal here. So the signal would be received by the dendrites and then it'll be sent through the soma to reach this area, which is our next functional zone. It is called the summation zone. And you're probably sitting there thinking, oh, what does summation mean? Some of you probably already know. It just means you're adding up the signals here. So in the summation zone, we're doing something extremely important. The signals are being added up. And ultimately, we are making a decision as to whether or not conduct the signal to another neuron. So one thing here, guys, that in the input zone, the signals that the neuron receives can be very different. Some may be stimulatory, some may be inhibitory, and they're kind of these shut-off signals for the neuron. But regardless of the kind of signal, they're all going to diffuse down to this, what is called the summation zone. And in the summation zone, the neuron is going to add them all up, the positive signals, the negative signals, and make a decision whether or not to pass that message on to another cell. And I'll tell you a couple of important things. We will talk about this again, but I don't think it's too early to introduce you to this idea. Your neurons have a resting membrane potential of minus 70 millivolts. We talked a little bit about resting membrane potential in the muscular system. We're going to talk about it a lot more in here in our discussion of the nervous system. But for neurons, when they're unstimulated, their resting membrane potential is about minus 70 millivolts. But for a neuron to be able to fire an action potential and essentially conduct that signal to another neuron, we have to reach what is called the threshold value. And for neurons, that threshold value is about minus 55 millivolts. It is actually a number. It's an electrical value. So in the summation zone, all of those signals that we would receive would have to cause basically a 15 millivolt shift in the membrane potential towards a more positive value. And if we do hit that minus 55 in the summation zone, then we would be conducting an action potential, a strong electrical stimulus down the axon. So the summation zone is really the decision zone for the neuron. But don't think that the neuron's sitting there and it's conflicted. It's really kind of waiting to hit that minus 55 to know whether or not it's appropriate to respond to the signal. Because remember, some things that the neuron receives, they could generate positive charge in the cell, but some of them will also be negative. So we do have to hit that minus 55 for the signal to continue on to another neuron. So the conduction zone would be where we're conducting an action potential. And I will say also, action potentials are going to be generated in, the first action potential would be generated in the summation zone. And then what happens is the sodium that comes in during the action potential is going to diffuse down the myelin into the node of Ranvier and generate a new action potential. And then the sodium coming in at that node would diffuse down this segment of myelin. And if we hit minus 55 in this node, we'll generate another action potential. And so what that does is it allows us to conduct that electrical signal down the axon. And we will talk much more about that process, so don't worry too much about some of the details of what's happening in the nodes. The idea here for us now is that the conduction zone will allow us to conduct that action potential down to what is called the output zone. So the output zone would be where that electrical signal, once it enters into the synaptic knob, can trigger an output. So you're putting something out of the neuron. And usually that's going to be neurotransmitter, okay, one of those neurotransmitters that we discussed on previous slides. So we will talk much more about kind of the physiology and what's happening in those zones, but be aware that you can break down those different parts of the neuron according to function. Okay, so neurons are very interesting dynamic structures, but they can be classified in a lot of ways. So what we're going to do now is just talk about some of the basics of neurons, and specifically, how they are classified according to function, structure, as well as location. For functional classes of neurons, there are three basic ones, and this really has to do with the direction or location of information flow or processing. So, there should be a G there, okay. So we have three functional classes of neurons: sensory neurons, something called interneurons, and then motor neurons. And these are pretty straightforward, I think, especially if you understand the subdivisions of the nervous system. We have sensory neurons that detect stimuli. So these are going to be our cells detecting things. And what they do is when they detect stimuli, they will transmit them to the CNS. So your sensory neurons are going to be ones that are involved in transmitting information to the central nervous system. We do have sensory neurons in almost every organ in the body, and they all end in the CNS. So each of these functional classes of neurons will have a beginning and an end in terms of location within the body. And your sensory neurons will start in almost every organ in the body, but they all end either in the brain or the spinal cord. They're also called afferents because what they will be doing is adding information to the CNS. Interneurons are interesting. They are entirely within the CNS. So these neurons are involved in receiving the sensory information and processing. I'm going to circle this like a million times. They're involved in processing the information that they receive and also storing it and retrieving it when needed. And they are really our decision makers. There are decision makers because they lie entirely within the CNS, and the function of the CNS is to make decisions. And it's these neurons that do that. 90% of all of the neurons are interneurons. So your nervous system dedicates a lot of real estate to these because they are what give us the processing power that we have to interpret a wide variety of different stimuli. These neurons are also called association neurons. I think, psychologists tend to call them association neurons, whereas biologists more so call them interneurons, but they do mean the same thing. So they're about 90% of all the neurons that are out there, and they're going to be the decision makers. So in terms of information flow, these neurons are going to sit in the middle. They are going to be receiving the information from the sensory neurons, and after these neurons make the decision, they're going to direct the game plan or the action of our outgoing motor pathways that are carried out by our motor neurons. So motor neurons are our third functional class of neuron. These all start, okay, in the CNS. They all start somewhere in the central nervous system, and they will stretch out to muscles of the body. They could be smooth muscles or even cardiac muscle or to skeletal muscle or the glands of the body. And they are the ones that can cause changes in the function of those structures. They are called motor because most of them do lead to muscles, and motor means movement, and muscles do movement. So motor neurons are ones that will be able to cause a change in the function of some structure in the body. They're also the efferent neurons, so you can refer to these as motor or efferent neurons that carry information that exits the CNS to those various structures. And one really important thing here to remember is that it is not something, these functional classes are never something that you should think about in isolation. I want you to think about this information flow all the time when you're thinking about the different classes of neurons and also the different subdivisions of the nervous system. So this diagram isn't a very complicated one, but it's a really helpful one, I think. And I want to spend some time going through this so we can really understand not only the flow of information between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system, but also the information path between the sensory interneurons and motor neurons. Okay, so this diagram is looking at the peripheral and the central nervous systems. And of course, you'll remember our central nervous system is made up of the brain as well as the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is going to be composed of nerves. And nerves are essentially groups of axons within the peripheral nervous system. And I'll just point out what we've got here. In step one, we've got a sensory neuron. So I'm going to go ahead and put a box around our sensory neuron. Okay, so, and I'll point out what the parts are of the sensory neuron. So these are dendrites, okay? This is going to be the cell body, and then this is actually the axon. And this little V-shaped structure, this is actually the synaptic knob. Okay, so those are your kind of three parts of the sensory neuron. And then let's just go ahead and circle the other neurons too and point out their parts. Okay, let me erase this a little bit. Okay, this purple neuron that I'm gonna circle, this is the interneuron. So the interneuron is gonna have its cell body as well as its axon and synaptic knob all located within the central nervous system. So think about the location of these various parts of the neuron. You know, for your sensory neurons, the dendrites and the soma and even the beginning of the axon, those were all in the periphery. But then the neuron actually ends in the CNS. So you can see the synaptic knob of our sensory neuron, it's actually ending in the CNS. So our interneuron, though, is entirely contained within the central nervous system, and it has a synaptic knob here, and that will allow it to stimulate this third neuron type, which is going to be the motor neuron. And the motor neurons actually start in the central nervous system. This would be the cell body. This would be the axon. And then these would actually be synaptic knobs. So these synaptic knobs would be kind of here at the end of the axon. And so the motor neurons, they will actually start out in the CNS, but then they end in the periphery because they're going to be able to contact these things called effectors. Effectors are just things affected by the nervous system. It could be a muscle, a gland, etc. And so let's kind of see what the information flow is here. I'm going to erase these structures. Okay, so I decided to duplicate the last slide just because there's a lot to say about this one, and I might do that more in this particular unit because sometimes there's a whole lot to say about one slide and we can kind of separate it out. So in the last slide, we were really talking about just where everything is relative to our parts of the neuron for our sensory neurons, our interneurons, and our motor neurons. And now what we want to focus on in this slide is more of a discussion of the flow of information between those different functional classes of neurons. One thing that I really want you to take away from the nervous system is that you can't really separate out most of the different sections of the nervous system. All these structures are really working together to achieve that common goal, which is communication and ultimately for the purposes of body coordination. Okay, so let's kind of start at the beginning here of our information flow with our sensory neurons. Remember, these are going to be ones that are located in the periphery, and they're going to have their dendrites and cell bodies close to body structures where they need to detect different stimuli. So let's say that, because they put a finger on this picture, let's say that person put their finger on a candle, okay, that's lit. So we've got a burning finger happening in this example. That information about the heat and the pain would be conducted along the sensory neuron. So these are dendrites here. This is going to be the cell body where we process the signal, and then the axon where we'll also be processing and relaying the signal. So we have that pain stimulus detected in the dendrites, and then the information would be conducted along the axon of the sensory neuron to this guy, which is the interneuron. The interneuron would be receiving information from the sensory neuron. This is a synapse between those two cells. And the interneuron would process the information that it receives. And it's pretty simple. In this example, that response on the interneuron's part would be that, hey, there's heat and fire and subsequent damage to the skin and body structures. You need to move your hand off of the flame. So the interneuron has a synapse in the CNS with the motor neuron. The motor neuron would receive the signal from the interneuron, generate an action potential that is going to conduct down the axon to these little synaptic knobs. And this is voluntary muscle. So this is actually a somatic motor neuron in this example, but we would release acetylcholine onto the muscle. It would contract at that point, and we'd be able to pull our hand off of the fire. But this information relay is very, very important. This example just happens to be a somatic sensory pathway and a somatic motor response. So, but you could do this with organs too, like the heart or lungs, etc. But this is just to really illustrate the information flow between our sensory neurons, our interneurons, and the motor neurons. There are also structural classifications for neurons. These are them. So we have the most common type of neuron is actually called a multipolar neuron. It's the one that we've mostly been looking at in these examples. They have one axon and then lots of dendrites. And that's a pretty typical structural arrangement for the neurons. There are also some neurons out there called bipolar neurons, meaning they have one axon, they have one dendrite and one axon, and that's where the bi part of it comes from. That means two. So they have two different processes, an axon and a dendrite off of a central cell body. These are not really super abundant neurons in terms of structural classifications, but where they do exist, they're very important we actually have bipolar neurons in the eye, in the retina of the eye. And they're very, very important for light detection within the retina. So there are examples of the bipolar neurons. It's just that's one of the more common places that you find it is the eye. Okay, last type is called the unipolar neuron. These are interesting. They have a cell body and then a central process and a peripheral process. And actually, the axon is part of both of those. And then there are also dendrites that can emanate off of the peripheral process as well. This is actually a type of neuron that you do see in sensory locations. So actually, you can see this example occurring in sensory neurons that are kind of close to the spinal cord. And we'll talk more about those neurons when we get a chance. But this is the second most common type structural class of neuron. Certainly the most common structural class is going to be the multipolar neuron. And multipolar is the most common, guys, just because, for neurons, they've always got their listening ears on, and just having multiple dendrites allows them to listen to a lot of different other cells in the body. Okay, so that's kind of it for our basic discussion of neurons, and that'll bring us into the last part of our lecture for today, which is the discussion of support cells of the nervous system called glial cells. The glial cells are also called neuroglia, but either one is fine. You can call them neuroglia or glia. There are several different types of support cells in the nervous system. Most of them are found only in the central nervous system, but there is one type of glial cell found in the peripheral nervous system. So you should kind of remember that most of these will be found only in the central nervous system. And the first one is the largest of our glial cell types, called the astrocyte. Astrocytes are called astro because they are star-shaped cells. So astro means star, cyte is a cell. These are the largest and most numerous type of glial cell. They're also the shape of a star. These are actually glial cells in this picture. These cells are so important. We have not talked much about this yet, but you do have neurons in the brain, but the neurons in the brain are not able to come into direct contact with the bloodstream. And that's because the blood can contain things that could poison the neurons and kill them, which would be really bad because the neurons are really involved in coordinating all your different body functions. So the astrocytes are going to serve as an intermediate between the bloodstream and the neurons. And so what they do, they can actually form part of what is called the blood-brain barrier, and they'll form a wall kind of between the blood vessels that supply the brain with blood and the neurons within the brain. And what they do, they have these little feet processes. We'll take a look at them in a few minutes. But these little feet of the astrocytes actually sit on blood capillaries. And what they can do is they can pull nutrients up from the blood vessels, from the blood capillaries, and then they transfer the nutrients over to the neurons. And then when neurons need to eliminate waste, they give them to the astrocytes who can secrete them into the bloodstream. So the astrocytes are extraordinarily important for keeping neurons healthy because they'll make sure that whatever they're pulling from the bloodstream isn't going to hurt the neurons. So they're very, very important cells. And it does turn out too that they can also modify neuron communication. That's not on the slide, but that is one of the more recently discovered functions of the astrocyte. These cells are able to also modify how neurons are communicating with each other. So they seem to have probably even more importance than we currently know. Microglia are also astrocytes only found in the CNS, These are very interesting cells as well. They seem to have some type of immune protection or defense protection for the brain. And they're these really small stationary cells, but if the brain is inflamed or there's any tissue damage within the brain, they get bigger. And then they can start moving around and carry out phagocytosis. Now, if you don't remember phagocytosis, go back to the cell unit because we discussed it quite a bit there. What it'll do is it'll allow the microglia to play kind of cleanup crew for the brain when it's inflamed and damaged. So the microglia are really important for keeping the brain free of debris and damage so it can function as normal. Okay, but normally these guys are really small, which is why they're called microglia. So very small cells, unless they're stimulated to be active. Then they get bigger and then they start moving around and trying to clear debris from the brain tissue. We also have some glial cells called ependymal cells. The ependymal cells are involved in the production of a really important fluid found within the brain. That fluid is called cerebrospinal fluid. We will talk about CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, later, but it is produced by these ependymal cells, and a lot of them are involved in circulating it through the central nervous system. So cerebrospinal fluid is thought to only be found within the brain and spinal cord. It's not really found outside of those body locations, but it's the fluid that you find in the CNS instead of blood. Okay, so that's what we have in the brain and the spinal cord, and we'll talk a little bit more about cerebrospinal fluid as we move into the brain unit. But the ependymal cells make it, and a lot of them actually have the ability to circulate the fluid too. So kind of twofold function. The next type of glial cell is called the oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocytes are involved in the production of myelin within the CNS. So again, most of these glial cells are just found in the CNS. But the oligos are involved in making myelin to cover the axon of various neurons. And a lot of these oligos are able to not just produce the myelin associated with the axon, they also kind of attach multiple neurons' axons together. So they're important not just for myelin production, but they're also important for holding axons of different neurons together. And we'll talk about what that is when you have a bundle of axons within the central nervous system. But these oligos tend to bundle axons of neurons together that serves a common function, or they go to the same place. So the oligos don't just make myelin, they also hold together the axons of neurons who are carrying out a common function or going to the same location within the central nervous system. So these are just some more pictures of our various glial cells. And again, these are going to be our CNS ones. We've talked about all of these so far. So you can see an astrocyte here. So these big star-shaped cells. And you can see the foot process of one here. So that's what those look like. But it's just really cool. They're able to put kind of their feet on the capillary. So the capillary is a blood vessel. And then if there's any like good nutrients in the capillary that the neuron needs, it'll pull up those nutrients through the foot process, and it'll essentially get transferred over to the other side of the astrocyte where there may be a neuron on the other side. So really important, kind of interesting stuff there. They'll serve as an intermediate between the blood and neurons. This one is our microglia, involved in phagocytosis and inflamed brain tissue. The ependymal cells, which are involved in cerebrospinal fluid production, And this group of ependymal cells, at least a lot of them with cilia present on the surface, remember cilia? Those ependymal cells with cilia would be involved in the circulation of fluids through the brain and spinal cord. So those ependymal cells that have cilia would be involved in circulating that cerebrospinal fluid. The last of our glial cells found within the CNS is this guy. That's the oligodendrocyte that is involved in not just production of that yellow myelin sheath, fatty insulating layer for the axon, but also involved in holding together the nerve fibers or axons of multiple neurons. So those are really your four glial cells found within the CNS. And then there's actually one within the peripheral nervous system, and it's called a Schwann cell. So the Schwann cells are our only type of glial cell found within the peripheral nervous system. And Schwann cells are going to do a couple things too. They are going to produce myelin within the peripheral nervous system, and they also can serve as a protective layer as well. So Schwann cells are not just myelinators, they're also protective cells as well. Because once they produce the myelin, so you can see the blue axon here, but they're producing myelin around the axon, and then the Schwann cell actually wraps itself around everything. And so the Schwann cell can become kind of a protective coating for different nerves of the peripheral nervous system too. Okay, and so that brings us to more of a formal discussion of our Schwann cells, which are the last type of cell, glial cell, that we're going to talk about today. Remember, Schwann cells are only found in peripheral neurons, so neurons of the peripheral nervous system. They do form myelin sheaths, so they are going to wrap myelin around the axons of the neurons that have them, and then they will also themselves become support and protective cells. Because in the peripheral nervous system, you're outside of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord are super well protected. They're protected, the brain's protected by the cranium, the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column, and then you also have another protective layer for those called the meninges that we'll talk about later. The peripheral nervous system structures are way more vulnerable. They have way less protection than central nervous system structures. So having the Schwann cells wrap around the axons after myelinating them, it just kind of helps keep the axon protected and healthy. The myelin is not continuous. We do have those nodes of Ranvier that we were talking about earlier, and we will talk more about those later. And then, like I was saying, a lot of the Schwann cells are going to cover the axon of the neuron that they're myelinating. But some of them also will cover the cell bodies of those same neurons. And if they do that, they are called satellite cells. So satellite cells are ones that provide even an additional layer of protection for neurons in the peripheral nervous system. Just another picture of the glial cells of the CNS. There are a lot of nice pictures in your textbook of the glial cells as well. So we've got, once again, our ependymal cells of the CNS, and then this is a great picture of an astrocyte. And what I like about it is you can see the feed processes on these little blood capillaries, and the feed processes also touching the neuron. And it is really neat, guys. The astrocytes can pull nutrients up in the feed processes and then transfer them over to the neuron via the other foot process. So they are literally serving as a barrier and an intermediary between the bloodstream and the neurons. So they're very, very important for normal nervous system function. There's an oligodendrocyte here, and once again, you can see it kind of helping form the myelin sheaths, but also holding these two neurons together. And that's another one of the functions of the oligo beyond just myelination. It'll help hold those neurons together. And then you can also see the microglia, which would be involved in phagocytosis of debris within the CNS to try to reduce inflammation and damage within within the brain tissue. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of today's lecture. And for the lectures next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about myelination, why it's important, and then we're going to get into some of the basic physiological characteristics of our neurons.